specific period of Goodman's career. This slide here gives you a good idea of what the film materials covered. So a large proportion of these films document Goodman's trips to various locations around the world: Thailand, Brussels, Holland, Russia, and other places. And if you look at the dates a little bit more carefully, you'll see that the materials focus mostly on the 50s and early 50s. And here's the rest of the description of the collection. As you might know, Goodman made a name for himself in the 20s and became really famous in the 30s, his early career culminating with the Carnegie Hall concert of January 1938. He and his band were the first to ever play jazz in this New York sanctuary of classical music. In the 40s and 50s, big band music became slightly less popular and gave way to other forms of jazz, such as bebop. Although Goodman was slightly active in that area, he sort of slipped a little bit out of the spotlight for a while. But the late 50s and the early 60s marked somewhat of a resurgence for Goodman. It also corresponds to an interest on the part of American authorities to showcase American cultural ingenuity abroad. As you know, the 50s and early 60s were the heart of the Cold War, culminating perhaps in October 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. At the same time, however, there were several attempts at the rapprochement between the two poles of the world, the USSR and America, of course. Jazz musicians had a role to play in this regard, and Goodman was actually the first jazz musician to travel to the USSR in 1962. And here's to set the stage, the completely unbiased video clip.
This is the first time in the history of Soviet-American cultural exchange relations that the Russians have permitted a foreign jazz band to tour the Soviet Union. And it was obviously an extremely difficult decision for the Russians to make. For the interest in jazz among the Russian people has been enormous. Most of those arriving tonight came in cars, are obviously the elite of this society, those lucky enough to be in positions of pull so that they could get the tickets. The Soviet government is obviously concerned about the reaction of ordinary Russians to Goodman's style of music, until recently denounced as vulgar and decadent. Now accepted but quite reluctantly. The government, realizing that there was little it could do to stop jazz from spreading here in Russia, short of the reimposition of Stalinist terror, which is something Khrushchev obviously did not want to do. It took years for the State Department to convince the Russians that Goodman's jazz was not sinister. Certainly not as sinister as Stalinism, but Soviet agreement was difficult to get. But tonight, adding their prestige to the opening night's performance, the very top leadership of the Soviet Communist Party appearing, quite surprisingly, led by Mr. and Mrs. Nikita Khrushchev. Next to Khrushchev, American Ambassador Thompson and his wife, and further down the line, Kozlov and Mikoyan. The very top people here in Russia, lending their prestige to an American jazz band, playing here in the Soviet Union. The first time this has ever been done.
I'll stop it here. I think we got the gist of it. So this slide gives a little bit more background on the event, and this is excerpted, a lot of it is excerpted from a book by Lisa Davenport, by Jazz Diplomacy. The Russians apparently feared jazz and considered it, as you heard, dangerous and even decadent. Nevertheless, for political reasons, they agreed to this tour, and it seems that actually they saw Goodman's jazz as a light and familiar enough art form to tolerate it. And some of the texts here kind of illustrate that. The Soviets kind of took issue with Armstrong, thinking that he was too exuberant and that it might cause riots. And they also took issue with Ellington's music, thinking that it was too far out and things like that. But Goodman, as opposed to what the commentator just said, Goodman was actually kind of well known in Russia already. And for that reason, they agreed to have the Goodman band visit. So Goodman's band was pretty well received in Russia, and the tour was a success, as this quote indicates. Indeed, quote, many hailed Goodman's tour as a rousing and inspiring turning point on both sides of the Iron Curtain, end quote. And Khrushchev himself was said to have liked the concert, although he seemed quite puzzled by the whole thing. Perhaps he didn't quite understand how jazz worked. It's often interesting to see how relationships between world leaders are so much more subtle than media outlets make them sound. And a letter like this is a good example. So there's many others like this one, but in the closing sentence there, Kennedy is thanking the chairman Khrushchev for his attendance at the concert. Another part of our film collection documents the Goodman band's trip to Thailand. And as you can tell from the New York Times report here, this visit was seen as very influential on diplomatic ties. Below the headline in the deck of the article, the band's visit was credited as doing more for U.S. ties than any other contemporary missions. The King of Thailand was apparently a good clarinetist and who loved swing music and was able to play and improvise with Goodman and his band. And Goodman said of his musical chops that they were, quote, not bad at all. And I read, if you look at this a little bit more, you see there's been a lot of interaction with the locals, and musicians learned to spell their name in Thai, and the band learned some traditional Thai songs that they arranged and things like that. So it was like, significant exchange. Somebody like Dave Brubeck wrote on the importance of jazz as a cultural weapon of sort. In this case, the racial aspect is brought up. And if you turn your attention to the first full paragraph of this 1950 New York Times article, which corresponds to the dates when our films were made, you can read that for Brubeck, jazz is colorblind. When a German or a Pole or an Iraqi or an Indian sees American white men and colored in perfect creative accord, when he finds out that they travel together, eat together, live together, and think pretty much alike socially and musically, a lot of the bad taste of Little Rock is apt to be washed from his mouth. So again, that's another aspect of the cultural missions that people like Goodman were leading. The Thailand trip was undertaken under the auspices of the United States of Information Services and its Voice of American program. Voice of America, sorry. This program has been seen by some people as a sort of positive, soft propaganda effort. But back then, distrust of big government was already kind of well alive, it seems. Some preferred, therefore, the free enterprise model. And this is a congressional statement following Goodman's trip to Brussels for the World's Fair of 1950. And we have footage in our collection that we're preserving about this. So the Honorable Homer Capehart, love this name, talks about the role of the Westinghouse Company in sponsoring Goodman's presence in Brussels. And the last paragraph reads, quote, I think that the Westinghouse Broadcasting Company should be commended for the public service it has rendered in demonstrating, and for demonstrating that private industry can achieve with goodwill and imagination what vast government-sponsored programs often cannot achieve, the bringing of people together for better understanding. So, again, this is another social aspect. So, these were just a few observations about how this film collection fits and informs a particular time period We have seen examples of how it relates to the Cold War, to civil rights issues, and even the size of government. I'm mostly a librarian and certainly not a jazz scholar, but I know that this collection is very fertile ground for even more than this. For example, our collection contains raw materials of a 1955 sextet recording session, and this footage, this raw footage is, I believe, a unique window into documentary filmmaking, and a rare view of how jazz recordings took shape back then. And there's a lot more examples, but it's time for me to turn it over to Francesca.
So I'm going to take us away from the history and the music and talk about the film and get a little more practical. And I promise this is the only chart I will show. I thought I'd start with a brief overview of the project's timeline just to give you a sense of where we are in the process. During the spring of 2013, our Preservation Services librarian assessed the collection. She placed AD strips to check for vinegar syndrome, and she checked the reels for other signs of physical deterioration. And according to the results of the AD strips, and that's what this chart shows, about 25% of the reels are in an active state of degradation, ranging from rapid decay starting, which is a 1.5 here, all the way up to critical, which is a 3. And I mean, I think it's sad, but it's also not as bad as it could be. You can see we have about the same amount at a 0, which means there's nothing wrong with them. And film is just a really sensitive medium, unfortunately. Also in the spring, in March, David G. Jessup, who is a Goodman scholar, visited and viewed most of the collection with Remy and developed a priority list based upon the rarity of the footage. The final set of film that became part of this project is a culmination of Jessup's research and assessment, as well as the Preservation Department's work as to what was most rare and what was most in danger of deterioration past the point of salvage. Remy wrote these findings up in a grant proposal. It was vetted through a library committee in pursuit of Arcadia funding. And if you don't know what Arcadia is a British-based granting agency that grants awards, let's see if this works, just to show you their site, grants awards to projects to preserve cultural heritage as well as biological heritage. I think they say exactly. Endangered culture and nature, which I just think is a really interesting mix of things to support, but great for us, as well as the biologists. So in June, Remy and I learned that the grant had been awarded, and we would be able to pursue this project with funds available starting last September. And I really came onto the project with Remy at that point. It was almost a condition of the award because the committee realized, really rightly so, that this would take more than one person's time dedicated to it. So this is a 16mm magnetic tape reel that actually is in our collection, and you can see it's in an active state of degradation. It doesn't take an expert, I think, to see all this curling around the edges. That's probably not such a good thing. So to date, we've been focused on getting physical control of the collection, using the old inventories, of which there are several. They're in competition with each other, and none of them are complete, but they are our guide. We've also had to make decisions about how we were going to proceed with the project, including coming up with this 3-phase approach that you see on the side. And we chose vendors for phase 1. And happily, as Remy mentioned earlier, our reels are all out of the vendors now, which is sad that we don't have anything to show you, but really we feel great that they're there and they're being worked on now. So we were really lucky early on to meet Brian Meacham. He's a new hire. He was a new hire at that point to the Film Study Center at Yale. He is trained as a film preservation archivist and had previously worked for the Film Academy in Hollywood in their archives. And incidentally, he's also a 5-day Jeopardy champ, which we were pretty excited to discover. So we were able to secure some assistance from him as an in-kind contribution from the Film Study Center. And we mainly seek him out when we reach stumbling blocks, ask him for his advice, and he's really been very helpful. It's been great. Hopefully we are sharing some of that advice we've gotten from him with you today. So you might recognize this guy. Brian suggested that a worthwhile part of any film preservation project is to visually inspect each reel. It's good to know of any pre-existing conditions, so to speak. On the one hand, it gives the vendor an idea of the type of work they're taking on, in addition to that preservation assessment. And on the other hand, it protects the library as you know what problems the material have before they leave your hands. And incidentally, this is actually the first thing vendors do with these reels when they get to them. So the experts in the field, when they want to know the content, they do exactly this. And just to tell you about it, this is Remy sitting at a workbench that has a light box in the middle built into the table here. He's moving a reel of film from one side to the other onto a new core on the far side. He's visually inspecting it as well as tactily inspecting it, running his hands along the edge. So you're checking for tears, for splices, for odd cuts on the edge of the film, if it's too brittle, if it's warping, and you're also looking for exposure issues, too light, too dark, too much red. He's moving pretty quickly through this, so it's not like watching an animation or something. You're just looking for really large-scale issues in the film. Here. And you can see my computer screen on the side there. I was recording as he went through each reel, so he would say, oh, there's a slice, and I would make a note of it, make a note of the discoveries. We also took pictures of each reel, and this is again looking to add to our physical control of the collection and gain more of an understanding of what is on the reels. This is a shot from reel 39, which is one of those Columbia recording session picture reels. And I just want to point out to you that this is a positive reel, so it's really easy to read. And we took this picture with that piece of footage, so we pressed down on the light box, so it's exposed to light, and under a loop, so magnified quite a bit. So it's sharp, you can see what's in that image. And the text on the side is a sample of the types of notes these are also that we took. These are also from reel 39. So you might guess from all of this description of the process, it's a pretty time-consuming process. And you would be right to guess that. In our case, it was valuable not only for the reasons I gave you before, but also because it really gave us a chance to check our inventories and to create an authoritative one. I don't doubt that we will learn more from our vendors as they begin to work with the material, and we can now add that new knowledge to our inventory very easily. Alongside getting this level of control over our collection, we spent the fall investigating and making decisions about the specific avenues we would take with this material. We had two strong and differing opinions to contend with. Brian, whose experience was in a well-funded shop with a sole focus on film, and our own preservation people, for whom this was just one project of many formats, many timelines, many budgets. When we applied for the grant, we did so with a more limited understanding of some of the choices we would need to make. And for media, it turns out there's a real tension between preservation and restoration. As Brian related to us at one point, you could basically spend your entire budget, upwards of $1 million, focused on restoring, or several $100,000 anyway, focused on restoring the soundtrack for one film. I mean, this is, he came from the Film Academy where they did this sort of thing. So, meanwhile, traditional preservation would seek to save as much content as possible, maybe at the risk of losing some quality through a lack of time or money to finesse the process. So with the money we had to prioritize the films, and we also had to prioritize the levels of work to be done. In the end, we chose to create analog duplicates of the picture reels, as well as derivatives. So if we have a negative master, we duplicate that. Then we make a positive master and an access copy. If we have a positive, that's the only reel we have. We make a negative from it, new positive, new access copy. We'll also get a low resolution digital file called a OneLight, and that's in preparation for phase 2, which I'll talk about. A OneLight is called a OneLight because the entire time they're digitizing it, they're running it with exposure with just one lighting situation, which is not what they do when they're really dealing with film, because the light changes depending on how the shot is done, and you would have someone sitting there and changing the light and how it's exposed. So this is just a low res, you'll be able to see the image, but it won't be perfect. The sound we are getting back digitally only, due in part to the extreme expense of new magnetic tape. We are getting an unedited master file, a slightly restored master, just minimally though, just basically to remove the blips and buzzes you get when you actually record that sound from the magnetic tape to digital. And we'll also get an access file. Phase 2 of the project, if we get the funding for it, will involve syncing the picture and sound reels and using those to create new composites, which are positive reels with a soundtrack intended for viewing. For the moment, most of our collection is separate picture reels and sound reels, and this is often the way that filmmakers stored sound before printing composites. Out to our vendors right now, we have 90 picture reels, 32 sound reels, and 7 composites, so 7 finished products. Before marrying the sound and the picture, syncing will involve understanding how the various picture reels relate to one another. There are often multiple cameras recording in a single scene, getting group shots, close-ups, action reels, action shots, and that's called, you'll sometimes hear A rolls and B rolls, and that's what that's referring to, these different types of shoots. And these reels are meant to be spliced together into one cohesive picture before adding that additional layer of sound. And this is a shot from, again, a close-up from the inspection from the workbench of a composite reel. This is reel 90 from the TV Kinescopes part of our collection. This is TV clips mainly from the Ed Sullivan Show, and I brought it up just so you can see this is a finished product, a composite, and that's the sound running along one side as high contrast sound wave lines. In phase 3, again, if we can secure funding, we'll create digital files for the composites, the masters and the access, and we'll ingest them to our digital repository. At the moment, our repository does not have a streaming capability. We hope that it will be in place by the time we reach phase 3, but if not, we'll just include that in our budget. We hope that at the end of phase 3, we'll be able to provide access to our patrons near and far, digitally and streaming. So, why pursue a project like this? It's pretty time intensive, it can be quite expensive. Well, I'd like to give you a couple of reasons that I think it's worth it. First of all, as I already said, the formats are very endangered. The film is a highly sensitive medium and content can be lost quickly. Some figures from the National Film Preservation Foundation. Library of Congress says that probably about 20% of US feature films from the 1910s and 20s still exist in full length. And of American features produced before the 50s, about half still exist. Beyond the medium itself, the machines are not being made anymore, and neither are the parts. And repairing and running those machines is also a skill that is really disappearing. Film is a format that's hard to read. This is a negative. I wanted the rest of my shots were positives, but I did want to pull up a negative for you to look at as well. You don't really know what you have until you methodically look through the collection, and often that requires the intervention of a machine. So we all might have really amazing collections, and they're completely accessible until we go through the process of looking at everything and catalog it and share it with our patrons. And some examples of recent discoveries of old footage are Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig playing ball in 1925, which I just read. I was Googling around trying to find some good ones. The mating behavior of the he-pen, a bird that has been extinct for a century. And even, this is audio, but I thought I'd give a little shout out. At Brown in 2012, they found a recording of a 1961 speech that Malcolm X gave here. So I want to give one last quote, also from the National Film Preservation Foundation. Still at risk, however, are documentaries, silent era movies, anthropological footage, avant-garde works, newsreels, home movies, works made for ethnic communities, industrial films, and other independent productions. We call these orphan films because they fall outside the scope of commercial preservation programs. Orphan films may document viewpoints, traditions, and places not depicted in the mainstream media and have a cultural value that transcends their simple origins. They often survive as one-of-a-kind copies in archives, libraries, museums, universities, and historical societies. And I incidentally would say that our collection almost entirely falls within those categories. So thank you, and we'd be happy to answer any questions. Yeah.
When you get the reels back from your vendors, have you made any provisions for what you're going to do with them at that point? Are you going to store them in a special way to prevent further degradation in case better preservation comes along or better digitization?
Yeah. Well, Yale has an outside. The library has an outside storage, which, as far as we know, is I think the temperature is 55 degree Fahrenheit, and that's good for films. So that's pretty much the plan. Yeah.
The originals and all of the new derivatives will be all on 3-inch cores, which is generally how you want to store film if you can. Most of our collection was still on reels, actually, which is how you project it, but you want to get them to cores. It's a bigger center, which apparently helps keep them more stable. And
we're getting archival canisters for all of the original collection and the new newly created reels also.
And then we'll go into this cold storage and hopefully be okay for quite some time.
Do the containers that the films are in, the original containers, do they have any documentary relevance at all?
They're interesting. I mean, it's a whole interesting
Yeah.
kind of can of worms with this project because it was Benny Goodman's collection. They seem to be in disagreement with some of the inventories, with some of the material, some of what we found inside, like on the footage. So, and there have been a lot of kind of people who have had a hand in this collection, a documentarian who worked on it, various librarians and archivists, various researchers. So it's a little hard to know, but we have all of that. I don't know that we will get those boxes back. I can't remember. Do you know? Presumably they'll send everything back. But we have photocopied everything and documented what was written on everything. Whether or not we'll see if it matches up. It'll be a good, interesting thing to figure out.
Because you have all these different versions now of films, what kind of cataloging are you doing on all this stuff? Or is that waiting until everything is kind of done with the preservation aspect?
We have a very brief record now, and there's also a finding aid for the whole collection. I think we plan to use the finding aid. There is a series for these films, and to do most of our description there. We'll probably beef up the cataloging record a bit once we have everything, but I don't know that we will do complete description there, because I think the finding aid will offer us quite a bit more granularity and ability to really describe what we want to. It will probably be part of phase 2.
When I wrote the grant, I purposely left cataloging out.
You didn't know we had me already.
Well, at first I don't know much about cataloging, and I knew it would be complicated because it's media and but it makes sense to figure out what your content is first before you start cataloging, especially with the kind of collection that we have.
Yeah, where it's so many reels are probably really intimately related, and we don't know all of those relations yet. I mean, we have an idea about some of them. Oh, this is probably the same session, etc. But it'll be helpful.
I was interested in the grant itself, and it sounds like you discovered a wonderful venue, and if you had come across other places that were involved in these types of projects, and also the length of your grant, whether you got any matching funds to assist with any of it.
It's an interesting situation. Do you want to talk about the Arcadia?
Yeah, I mean so I think in 2000, I can't remember what year exactly, 2009 I think, the Yale University Library received a $5 million grant from Arcadia, and the money was separated in 5 years, so we got $1 million at a time, and it was also determined that there would be a committee at the library administering that money and deciding who would get funds locally.
And
Yeah.
Go ahead. You're talking about it.
So when I applied for the grant initially, it's actually an internal application of some sort. So it's not like a typical application in many ways. A very similar grant is the NEH Humanities and Preservation. I can't remember the exact name of it.
And I was just going to I just wanted to show you this one. This is a great site. There's a couple of really great Film Foundation sites that are useful for getting more information, and many of them offer grants. So if you're considering pursuing a project and don't know your library director has $5 million in your pocket for many projects, not just ours, but this might be an avenue to take as well.
But this is something we haven't really said, but film preservation is extremely expensive. So we have about 140 films more or less, and I asked for $260,000, and it turns out that we don't really have quite enough to take care of everything.
So we're not even doing everything.
Yeah,
right?
so it's a little crazy to be honest, but that's what it is.
Yeah, I mean, and many of these sites as well also talk about what you can do, basic steps you can take if you can't get the grant to do real preservation on it. So
it's brought up also, all kinds of questions in terms of digital preservation versus analog preservation, and I really felt uneasy about digitizing everything, and that's my end product, because I felt like Yale Library wasn't ready for prime time, if you will, in terms of preserving those digital files and providing access to them also. So I felt that producing new analog copies was the golden way to do this. Yeah.
I think we're out of time, but I hope you'll join me in giving another round of applause for all of our presenters today. I believe there are people who are able to allow us to be ducklings to follow them at the reception if necessary.